The envelope had been sitting on Elena Rossi's kitchen counter for 3 days now, cream-colored and expensive-looking, with her name written across the front in elegant script that somehow made the contents more terrifying rather than less. She had opened it once, read the first 2 lines. Outstanding balance, $47,000. And final notice before collection. And then shoved it back into the envelope with shaking hands, as though not looking at the words could somehow make them less real. Now, as she stood at the sink washing the dinner dishes, while her 7-year-old daughter Sofia did homework at the small table behind her, Elena could feel the weight of that envelope like a physical presence, a promise of ruin that no amount of ignoring could prevent from arriving. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms in a building that had seen better decades, but Elena had tried to make it warm and safe for Sofia, despite their circumstances. Cheerful yellow curtains hung in the kitchen window, and Sofia's artwork covered the refrigerator in a riot of color that made Elena's heart ache every time she looked at it. This was their sanctuary, the place she had fled to 2 years ago when she had finally gathered the courage to leave Marco's father, when the bruises had become too frequent and the apologies had lost all meaning. She had thought that leaving Vincent would be the hardest thing she would ever do, but she had been wrong. The hardest thing was what came after, the constant struggle to keep them fed and housed and safe on her waitress wages, the mounting debt from medical bills after Sofia had gotten pneumonia last winter, the slow, suffocating realization that she was drowning and there was no rescue coming. And then Vincent had died 6 months ago, a heart attack at 43, sudden and final. And Elena had allowed herself one moment of guilty relief before the real nightmare began. Because Vincent, it turned out, had borrowed money from very dangerous people. A lot of money. And those people had decided that his debts now belonged to his widow, regardless of the fact that they had been separated when he died, regardless of the fact that Elena had no idea he had even taken out the loan. The knock on the door came at exactly 8:30, just as it had said it would in the letter. Elena's hands stilled in the soapy water, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Behind her, Sofia looked up from her math homework, her dark eyes curious and innocent in a way that made Elena want to weep. "Mama, someone's at the door." "I know, baby." Elena dried her hands on a dish towel, forcing her voice to stay calm, even though panic was clawing its way up her chest. "Stay here, okay? Keep working on your homework. Mama needs to talk to someone." She moved through the tiny living room on legs that felt disconnected from her body, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. Maybe she could convince them to give her more time. Maybe she could work out a payment plan. Maybe, and this was the thought that terrified her most, maybe they weren't here to negotiate at all. The man standing in her doorway was not what Elena had expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had been expecting. He was tall and broad-shouldered, filling the doorframe with a presence that was somehow both threatening and controlled. His suit was expensive, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, tailored perfectly to his athletic build, and his dark hair was styled in a way that suggested he had just come from somewhere important. But it was his face that made Elena's breath catch, strong jaw shadowed with evening stubble, sharp cheekbones, and eyes so dark they were nearly black, currently fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back, even as something in her hindbrain insisted she hold her ground. "Elena Rossi." His voice was deep and rough, with the faint trace of an Italian accent that her grandmother would have been able to place by region, but that Elena only recognized as familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby. "Yes." The word came out smaller than she intended, and she hated herself for the fear she could hear in it. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin even though her hands were trembling. "I assume you're here about Vincent's debt." Something flickered across the man's face. Surprise, maybe, that she was addressing it directly, before his expression smoothed back into careful neutrality. "Dante Caruso," he said, not offering his hand. "May I come in?" It wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. But there was something about the way he asked that suggested he was giving her the option to refuse, even if they both understood she couldn't actually do that. Elena stepped back, opening the door wider, and tried not to think about the fact that she was inviting a dangerous man into the home where her daughter was doing homework. Dante moved past her into the small living room, and Elena was struck by how much space he seemed to take up, how her modest furniture suddenly looked shabby and worn in contrast to his expensive suit and polished shoes. His gaze moved around the room, taking in the second-hand couch with its faded floral print, the bookshelf made from cinder blocks and planks that Sofia had helped her paint blue, the stack of bills on the end table that Elena hadn't been able to bring herself to open. She saw the apartment through his eyes and felt shame burn hot in her chest, followed immediately by anger at herself for feeling ashamed. She had nothing to be embarrassed about. She worked hard. She took care of her daughter. It wasn't her fault that Vincent had left her with debts she couldn't pay. "Ms. Rossi, it's not my debt." The words burst out of Elena before she could stop them, propelled by desperation and fury in equal measure. "Vincent and I were separated when he died. We weren't together. I didn't even know he had borrowed money until that letter came. I had nothing to do with whatever he needed it for, and I shouldn't be responsible for paying it back." Dante's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he had heard variations of this argument before. "Vincent Rossi was your husband at the time of his death, under the terms of the loan agreement." "I never signed any loan agreement," Elena interrupted, her voice rising despite her attempts to stay calm. "I never agreed to anything. You can't hold me responsible for debts I didn't consent to." "The law in these matters is flexible," Dante said, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone, though his face remained impassive. "Your husband borrowed money from my employer. That money was used in part to pay for medical expenses for your daughter. Hospital bills from last winter. Do you remember those?" Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Sofia's pneumonia. The 3 days in the hospital that had felt like 3 years, watching her daughter struggle to breathe, listening to machines beep and doctors speak in careful, measured tones about complications and monitoring. The bills had come afterward, monstrous amounts that Elena's part-time job and non-existent insurance couldn't begin to cover, and Vincent had shown up at the hospital with a check, had told her not to worry about it, that he had taken care of everything. "He said it was from his mother," Elena whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "He said his mother wanted to help with Sofia's medical bills." "His mother has been dead for 6 years," Dante said quietly, and there was something in his voice now that might have been pity. "The money came from my employer. Vincent agreed to terms. Those terms included provisions for repayment in the event of his death. Provisions that fall on his widow." Elena wasn't asking. She already knew the answer. She could see it in Dante's face, in the careful way he was watching her, as though bracing for her to either collapse or attack him. She did neither. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself and tried to think past the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her completely. "I don't have $47,000. I don't have $4,000. I barely have $400. I work as a waitress, Mr. Caruso. I make minimum wage plus tips. My daughter and I live on rice and beans most nights, so I can keep this apartment. I have nothing you can take." "Everyone has something," Dante said, but he didn't sound happy about it. He moved closer, and Elena forced herself not to retreat, even though every instinct screamed at her to put distance between them. This close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of leather and spice, and see the faint lines around his eyes that suggested he was older than his 30s, though not by much. "My employer isn't unreasonable, Ms. Rossi. He understands that circumstances can change. There are alternatives to monetary repayment." The way he said it made Elena's stomach drop, made her mind jump immediately to the kinds of alternatives that vulnerable women throughout history had been forced to provide to powerful men. She thought of Sofia in the next room, hunched over her homework, trusting that her mother would protect her, and something fierce and furious rose up in Elena's chest. "No," she said flatly. "Whatever you're suggesting, whatever your employer thinks I might be willing to do to clear this debt, no, I won't do it. You'll have to." "Mama?" Sofia's small voice cut through Elena's building tirade, and both adults turned to see the little girl standing in the kitchen doorway, her math workbook clutched to her chest and her dark eyes wide with concern. "Who is this man? Are you okay?" Elena's heart fractured at the worry in her daughter's voice, at the way Sofia's gaze kept darting between her mother and the stranger in their living room, with the wariness of a child who had learned too young that men who made her mother upset were dangerous. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and dropped to her knees in front of Sofia, cupping her daughter's face with both hands. "I'm fine, baby," she said, infusing her voice with as much calm certainty as she could manufacture. "This is Mr. Caruso. He's here to talk to Mama about some boring grown-up business. Why don't you go to your room and read for a bit? I'll come say goodnight in a few minutes, okay?" Sofia's eyes searched her face with the perceptiveness that sometimes startled Elena, with its maturity. "You look scared, Mama." "I'm not scared," Elena lied, pressing a kiss to Sofia's forehead. "I promise. Now go on. I'll be there soon." Sofia went, but not before casting one more suspicious glance at Dante over her shoulder. When she had disappeared into her bedroom and closed the door, Elena stood slowly and turned back to face the man who held her daughter's future in his hands. Something had changed in his expression while he watched her interaction with Sofia, a softness around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a slight easing of the tension in his shoulders. "How old is she?" he asked quietly. 7. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "She just turned 7 last month. She's smart and funny, and she loves drawing and horses and those ridiculous chapter books about girls who solve mysteries. She has friends at school and a teacher who says she's reading at a 5th grade level. She's everything good in my life, Mr. Caruso. She's everything." Dante's jaw tightened, and he looked away from Elena toward the closed bedroom door, his hands sliding into his pockets in a gesture that seemed almost uncomfortable. "The alternatives I was going to suggest," he said carefully, "were not what you were thinking. My employer owns several legitimate businesses, restaurants, clubs, a few retail establishments. You could work for him. Your wages
would not survive another month without proper nutrition. The psychological burden was perhaps even heavier than the physical one. Britain had always prided itself on resilience, on the stiff upper lip, on carrying on regardless of circumstances. But there was something uniquely demoralizing about hunger. It was relentless, inescapable, and deeply personal. One could be brave in the face of bombs, could stand defiant against the threat of invasion, but hunger worked from within, weakening not just the body but the spirit itself. In schools across the nation, teachers reported children too listless to learn, too weak to play. The next generation of Britons was growing up malnourished, their physical and cognitive development stunted by deprivation. What would this mean for Britain's future? Even if they won the war, what kind of victory would it be if the nation's children were permanently damaged? As spring turned to summer in 1942, Britain endured, but endurance was not enough. Washington, D.C., late spring, 1942. In the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat in his wheelchair, studying the reports from Britain with growing concern. Churchill's letters had become increasingly desperate, the statistics more alarming with each diplomatic pouch that crossed the Atlantic. The Prime Minister's usual eloquence now carried an edge of genuine fear. Britain was starving. Roosevelt had long ago decided that Britain's survival was essential to American security and to the future of democracy itself, but deciding and delivering were two different matters entirely. He faced a Congress still divided on the extent of American involvement, an American public wary of foreign entanglements, and military commanders who argued that every ton of food shipped to Britain was a ton that might be needed for American troops. The meeting in the Oval Office that afternoon included Secretary of Agriculture, Claude Wickard, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and representatives from the Department of State. The discussion was frank and sometimes heated. America's agricultural abundance was real. The nation's farmers could produce enough to feed both America and Britain, but converting that capacity into actual food shipments across a submarine-infested ocean was a monumental undertaking. The logistics alone are staggering, Stimson argued, spreading maps across Roosevelt's desk. We're talking about millions of tons of food, grain, meat, cheese, powdered eggs, canned goods. We'll need hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors, and a convoy system that can protect them from U-boat attacks. Every ship we dedicate to food is a ship not carrying weapons or troops. Wickard countered with his own calculations. But if Britain collapses from starvation before we can mount an invasion of Europe, what good are those weapons and troops? Churchill isn't exaggerating, Mr. President. The British are in genuine crisis. Their agricultural system.
Decide whether to sell 5 years of her life to a criminal or risk losing everything, including possibly Sofia. It wasn't a choice at all, and they both knew it. The restaurant was even more intimidating than Elena had imagined. All dark wood and pristine white tablecloths, and soft classical music that drifted through the dining room like expensive perfume. She stood in the small entryway, her second-hand black slacks and white button-down shirt, suddenly feeling shabby despite the fact that this was literally all she owned that could pass for professional attire, and tried to convince herself that she could do this. It was just a job. She had been a waitress before. She could handle difficult customers and demanding managers and the endless exhausting grind of being on her feet for 8 hours straight. The fact that she would be doing it to pay off a debt to a man whose name she didn't even know, whose business practices were certainly illegal and possibly violent, was just an unfortunate detail she would have to live with. A woman in her 40s with severe features and an immaculate black suit appeared from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Elena Rossi? Yes. Elena straightened her spine, forcing herself to meet the woman's assessing gaze without flinching. I'm here about the position. Francesca, I manage the floor. The woman's eyes moved over Elena with clinical efficiency, taking in her clothes, her worn shoes, the way she was holding herself with rigid control that suggested she was barely keeping herself together. Whatever Francesca saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded once and gestured toward the back of the restaurant. Training starts immediately. You'll work tonight's dinner service shadowing one of our senior servers. I expect perfection, Ms. Rossi. Our clientele has very high standards, and they don't care about whatever personal circumstances brought you here. Understood? Understood, Elena said, and followed Francesca through the dining room toward the kitchen, trying not to feel like she was walking toward her own execution. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of table numbers and wine pairings and the intricate choreography of fine dining service. Elena shadowed a woman named Gianna, who had been working at Moretti's for 7 years, and who moved through the dining room with the grace and efficiency of someone who could do this job in her sleep. By the end of the dinner service, Elena's feet ached and her head was spinning with information about which fork went where and how to present a wine bottle and the proper way to clear plates without disturbing the other diners, but she thought she might actually be able to do this. The tips were, as Dante had promised, significantly better than what she made at her current diner job, and the other servers seemed professional, if not particularly warm. She was hanging up her apron in the small break room when Francesca appeared in the doorway, her expression as severe as it had been when Elena first arrived. You did adequately, she said, which Elena suspected was the closest thing to a compliment Francesca gave. You'll start regular shifts tomorrow, 5 evenings a week, 5 to midnight. Don't be late. I won't be. Elena grabbed her purse from the locker and tried to calculate in her head whether she could afford to take a taxi home, or if she'd have to walk the 12 blocks in the dark. Probably walk. Every dollar counted now more than ever. Ms. Rossi? Francesca's voice stopped her at the door. Mr. Caruso asked me to let him know when you finished your first shift. He's waiting in the office upstairs. He'd like to speak with you. Elena's stomach dropped. but she nodded and followed Francesca's directions through a hallway and up a narrow staircase to a door marked private. She knocked, her heart hammering, and heard Dante's voice tell her to enter. The office was small but elegantly appointed, with a massive desk dominating the space and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city lights. Dante sat behind the desk, his suit jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, and he was reading something on his laptop with the kind of focused intensity that suggested whatever it was had his complete attention. When Elena closed the door behind her, he looked up, and for just a moment, she saw surprise flicker across his face, as though he had forgotten he had asked for her. "Ms. Rossi." He stood, moving around the desk, with that same controlled grace she had noticed the first night. "How was your first shift?" "Fine." Elena stayed near the door, maintaining distance between them, even though the office was small enough that it barely mattered. "Francesca said I did adequately." The corner of Dante's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "High praise from Francesca. She doesn't suffer incompetence." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit. I promise I won't bite." Elena sat because her feet hurt too much to keep standing, but she perched on the edge of the chair, ready to flee if necessary. Dante settled back into his own chair and studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes moving over her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "I need to ask you something," he said finally, "and I need you to answer honestly. Did Vincent ever hurt you? You or your daughter?" The question caught Elena completely off guard, and she felt her carefully constructed composure crack slightly. "Why does that matter?" "Because it matters to me." Dante's voice was quiet but firm. "Answer the question, Elena." The use of her first name did something strange to her chest, made the question feel somehow more intimate, more important. She looked down at her hands, at the thin gold wedding band she still wore, even though Vincent had been dead for 6 months, even though their marriage had been over long before that. "Yes," she said softly. "He hurt me. Never Sofia, never our daughter, but yes. That's why I left him. Why we were separated when he died." Dante's jaw clenched hard enough that Elena could see the muscle jump beneath his skin, and something dark and dangerous flashed through his eyes before he controlled it. "I see." "Does that change anything?" Elena heard herself ask. "About the debt? About this arrangement?" "No." Dante's voice was rough, almost angry, though Elena sensed the anger wasn't directed at her. "The debt stands, but I want you to know, what happened to you, what Vincent did to you, that's not how we operate. You work here, you're under our protection. That means no one touches you without permission. No customer, no coworker, no one. If anyone makes you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. Understood?" Elena stared at him, trying to reconcile this man, this dangerous man who collected debts for a living, with the fierce protectiveness in his voice. The way he was looking at her, like the thought of someone hurting her, genuinely enraged him. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. "Why do you care?" she asked before she could stop herself. "I'm just someone working off a debt. Why does it matter to you whether I was abused?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I've seen what men like Vincent do to women like you," he said finally. "Women who are too trusting, too forgiving, too willing to believe that this time will be different. And I've seen the damage they leave behind. You're trying to protect your daughter, trying to build a life for her despite everything Vincent did to you, despite the impossible situation he left you in. That takes strength, Elena. That takes courage. And I respect that." The words settled over Elena like a blanket, unexpected and warming, and she found herself blinking back tears she hadn't realized were forming. No one had called her strong in years. No one had acknowledged what it cost her to keep fighting, to keep going, to keep her daughter safe and fed and loved, despite the constant weight of fear and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it more than she had meant anything in a long time. Dante nodded once, then stood and pulled an envelope from his desk drawer. "This is your first week's pay. Half goes to the debt, half is yours. I've also taken the liberty of arranging for childcare for Sofia while you're working. There's a woman, Mrs. Chen, who lives in your building. She has grandchildren she watches during the day, and she's agreed to watch Sofia in the evenings as well. The cost will be deducted from your portion of the tips, but it should still leave you with more than you're making now." Elena stood slowly, accepting the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was more money than she had seen in months, even after whatever had been taken out for the debt and childcare. "You arranged childcare for my daughter? You can't work if you're worried about where Sofia is or whether she's safe," Dante said simply, as though this was obvious, as though going out of his way to ensure the well-being of the child of someone who owed him money was perfectly normal behavior. "Mrs. Chen came highly recommended. She'll expect Sofia at 4:30 tomorrow." Elena looked up at him, this dangerous man in his expensive shirt, with his dark eyes and his unexpected kindness, and felt something shift in her chest, some locked door beginning to crack open despite her best efforts to keep it sealed. "I don't understand you." "You don't have to understand me," Dante said, but his voice was gentle. "You just have to show up on time and do your job. The rest will take care of itself." He walked her downstairs and waited while she gathered her things, then insisted on calling a car to take her home, despite her protests that she could walk. As the car pulled away from the curb, Elena looked back through the rear window and saw him still standing there, watching to make sure she left safely, and felt the cracks in that locked door widen just a little more. The weeks that followed fell into a strange new rhythm. Elena worked 5 nights a week at Moretti's, her feet learning the layout of the dining room, her hands learning the weight of the expensive plates, her voice learning the careful dance of professional courtesy that high-end customers expected. She got better at reading tables, at knowing when to hover and when to disappear, at extracting maximum tips through a combination of competence and charm. Gianna took her under her wing, teaching her the unspoken rules of the restaurant and covering for her when she made mistakes. And gradually, the other servers began to accept her as one of their own, rather than the debt-laden outsider she had started as. Sofia thrived under Mrs. Chen's care, coming home each night with stories about the other children and the crafts they had made, and the books Mrs. Chen read to them before dinner. She seemed happier than Elena had seen her in months, more relaxed, and Elena tried not to think about the irony that her daughter's life had actually improved because Elena was now working for criminals to pay off her dead husband's debts. And then there was Dante. He came to the restaurant most evenings, always immaculate in his expensive suits, always moving through the dining room with that controlled grace that suggested coiled power beneath the civilized exterior. He never ate in the dining room. His meals were always delivered to the office upstairs, but he made a point of walking through during the dinner service, observing the staff, ensuring everything ran smoothly. His presence made the other servers nervous, made them stand up straighter and move faster, but Elena found that she had stopped being afraid of him somewhere between the first night he had shown up at her door and the night he had arranged childcare for her daughter. He always stopped at her tables, always asked how she was managing, always listened with that focused intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. And sometimes, late at night when the restaurant was closed and Elena was counting out her tips, he would come downstairs and they would talk. About nothing important at first: the weather, Sofia's progress in school, the challenges of working in fine dining. But gradually, inevitably, the conversations deepened. She learned that Dante had grown up in this neighborhood, that his father had worked for the same organization Dante now worked for, that he had been groomed for this life since childhood. She learned that he had a younger sister he was putting through medical school, that he read voraciously despite the nature of his work, that he spoke 4 languages and had never been outside the country. She learned that he hated violence, but accepted it as a necessary part of his world, that he believed in honor and loyalty above all else, that he was trying to transition his employer's business toward legitimate enterprises, even though that transition would take years and require more patience than most of the old guard had. In return, Elena found herself sharing things she rarely talked about: her childhood growing up in a family that valued appearances over honesty, the way she had married Vincent at 19, because he had seemed strong and protective, and she had been too young to recognize the difference between protection and control. She told him about the slow erosion of her self-worth over the years of her marriage, about the way Vincent had isolated her from her friends and family until she had no one to turn to, about the night she had finally left, clutching Sofia's hand and a bag of hastily packed clothes, and absolutely no plan beyond getting away. Dante listened to it all with that same focused intensity, and Elena could see anger burning in his dark eyes when she described the worst of it, could see his hands clench into fists when she mentioned the times Vincent had grabbed her hard enough to leave bruises. But he never interrupted, never offered platitudes or empty reassurance, and somehow that made it easier to keep talking, to keep pulling out these poisonous memories and laying them between them like offerings. "I'm glad he's dead," Dante said one night, when Elena had finished a particularly difficult story, his voice rough with barely controlled fury. "I know that makes me a terrible person, but I'm glad. And if he wasn't already dead, I would—" He stopped himself, jaw clenching, and looked away from her toward the darkened windows. "I would make sure he never touched you or Sofia again." The words should have frightened her, should have reminded her that Dante was dangerous, that he worked for dangerous people, that the protection he was offering came with strings and complications she couldn't begin to untangle. But instead, Elena felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that had been cold and clenched for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to feel safe. "Thank you," she said quietly, and when Dante looked back at her, the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "Elena!" he started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with something internal. "I shouldn't— This isn't— You're here because of a debt. I have no right to—" "To what?" Elena heard herself ask, her heart suddenly pounding. They were sitting in the empty restaurant at 1 a.m, the chairs upturned on the tables around them, and the city lights spilling through the windows, and the space between them felt charged with something she was afraid to name. Dante stood abruptly, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that made him seem younger, less controlled. "To feel the way I'm starting to feel about you," he said roughly. "To think about you constantly. To want to—" He stopped again, turning away from her toward the windows. "You should go home, Elena. It's late. I'll call you a car." But Elena stood and crossed the space between them before she could think better of it, before fear or common sense could make her reconsider. She laid her hand on his arm, felt the tension vibrating through him, and when he turned to look at her, the vulnerability in his face took her breath away. "I think about you too," she said softly, and watched his eyes widen slightly with surprise. "I know I shouldn't. I know this is complicated and messy, and probably a terrible idea. But I can't stop thinking about you, Dante. About the way you protected Sofia and me from the very beginning. About the kindness you've shown us even though you had no obligation to. About the way you make me feel safe for the first time in years." Dante's hand came up to cup her face, his palm warm against her cheek, and Elena found herself leaning into the touch, despite every warning bell going off in her head. "This is a bad idea," he said, but he was moving closer, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "You're vulnerable, and I'm in a position of power over you, and I should have more control than this." "Maybe," Elena agreed, her eyes locked on his. "Or maybe we both deserve something good after so much darkness. Maybe we deserve each other." Dante's eyes searched her face for a long moment, and Elena could see the war happening behind them: duty versus desire, obligation versus want. Then something seemed to break in him, some last thread of resistance snapping, and he leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, to change her mind, to preserve the careful, professional distance they had been maintaining. Elena didn't pull away. She rose up on her toes to meet him halfway, her hands sliding up to grip his shoulders. And when their lips finally met, it felt like coming home after a long exile. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as though both of them were afraid of breaking something fragile. But then Dante made a rough sound, low in his throat, and pulled her closer, one hand sliding into her hair, while the other wrapped around her waist, and Elena forgot how to breathe, forgot everything except the way he tasted like coffee and something darker, forgot everything except the way his body felt solid and safe against hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers and laughed, a rough, slightly disbelieving sound that made Elena's heart clench. "Christo," he muttered, "we're in so much trouble." "Probably," Elena agreed, but she was smiling despite herself, feeling lighter than she had in years. "What happens now?" Dante pulled back slightly, his dark eyes serious as they searched her face. "Now I take you home, and I don't push you for more than you're ready to give. And tomorrow we figure out how to do this without compromising your safety or your daughter's well-being. Because I meant what I said, Elena. You're under my protection now, both of you, and I don't take that lightly." "I know," Elena said softly, and she did know, could see the sincerity burning in his eyes. "I trust you, Dante. I shouldn't, but I do." His expression softened, and he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead before stepping back and pulling out his phone to call her a car. While they waited, Elena let herself imagine what this could become, this thing growing between them, this unexpected connection born from impossible circumstances. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and she had no idea if they could actually make it work given everything stacked against them. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena found herself hoping anyway. The driver arrived, and Dante walked her out, his hand warm at the small of her back, and when the car pulled away, Elena looked back to see him still standing there, under the restaurant's awning, watching to make sure she left safely, just like he always did. And in that moment, despite everything, the debt, the danger, the complications, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they deserved this second chance at happiness, both of them.